In the quiet suburbs of Denton, Texas, Officer Mark Hayden had just started his night shift. Mark had been on the force for over 6 years, and most of his nights were uneventful. Speeding tickets, noise complaints, or the occasional drunk driver. But on that warm evening in June 2024, a call came in that would stay with him forever. The dispatcher's voice crackled through the radio. Unit 47, we've got a possible intruder in a residence. Caller is a young female, locked herself in her bedroom. Address is 412 Maple Drive. Mark acknowledged the call and flipped on his lights, weaving through the mostly empty streets. Intruder calls always raised his adrenaline, even if they often turned out to be nothing. A raccoon in a trash can or a tree branch brushing against a window. But something about the tremble in the dispatcher's voice told Mark this one might be different. When Mark arrived at the house, it was eerily quiet. The driveway was empty, and the porch light flickered faintly, casting long shadows across the front yard. Mark stepped out of his patrol car, hand instinctively resting on his holstered gun. "Denton PD," he called out as he approached the door. A soft voice responded from inside. "Please hurry. He's still in here." Mark's pulse quickened. He knocked on the door, then tried the handle. It was unlocked. Pushing it open slowly, he stepped into the dimly lit living room. The house was small but tidy, with signs of a lived-in home. A blanket draped over the couch, family photos on the walls. "Ma'am, it's Officer Hayden. Where are you?" "Upstairs," the voice replied, barely above a whisper. Mark moved cautiously, his boots barely making a sound on the carpeted stairs. He reached the second floor and saw a door slightly ajar at the end of the hallway. Approaching it, he heard the soft sound of someone crying. "Ma'am, are you okay?" The door creaked open, revealing a young woman curled up in the corner of the bedroom. She looked to be in her early 20s, her face pale and tear-streaked. "He's in the house," she whispered. "I heard him downstairs, then the stairs creaking. I locked the door, but I don't know if it's enough." Mark nodded, trying to keep his voice calm. "Stay here. I'm going to check the rest of the house." He left the room, gun drawn, and began methodically searching each room. The house was quiet, almost too quiet, as he checked closets, under beds, and behind doors. But he found nothing. When he returned to the young woman's room, she looked at him with wide, frightened eyes. "Did you find him?" "No one's here," Mark said, though he wasn't entirely convinced. "Are you sure you heard someone?" She nodded frantically. "I heard footsteps and breathing." Mark's gaze scanned the room, landing on the bed. A sense of unease crept over him. "Stay right there," he said, his tone firm. Mark crouched down and slowly lifted the bed skirt. His flashlight beam swept across the dark space beneath the bed, and that's when he saw it, eyes staring back at him. A man was crammed into the small space, his face partially obscured by shadows. His breathing was heavy, and his hands were clenched tightly around something, a knife. Mark's training kicked in. "Drop the weapon and come out slowly," he barked, his gun aimed at the man. The intruder didn't move, his grip tightening on the knife. "I said drop it," Mark repeated, his voice louder this time. The man finally released the knife, letting it clatter to the floor. Slowly, he crawled out from under the bed, his gaunt frame and wild eyes sending a chill down Mark's spine. Mark restrained the man and called for backup. As he cuffed him, the man muttered incoherently, his words a jumble of paranoia and anger. When the other officers arrived, they searched the man and found rope, duct tape, and a pair of gloves stuffed into his pockets. The young woman sat on the edge of her bed, trembling as Mark explained what had happened. "Do you know this man?" he asked gently. She shook her head. "I've never seen him before." As the man was escorted out of the house, Mark noticed something odd. The intruder kept glancing back at the young woman, his lips curling into a sinister smile. The next day, Mark learned the man had a long history of stalking and breaking into homes. But what made Mark's stomach churn was the detail he shared during interrogation. "I've been watching her for weeks," the man confessed, his tone disturbingly calm. "I knew she'd be alone tonight." The young woman was moved to a safe location while the man awaited trial. Mark couldn't shake the memory of the intruder's face, the wild eyes, the twisted smile, and the quiet malice behind his words. Years later, Mark still thinks about that night. He's responded to countless calls since then, but none have stuck with him quite like the night he found a man under the bed, waiting for his chance to strike. And every time he recalls the woman's trembling voice, he feels a renewed sense of purpose, to protect those who can't protect themselves, even from the monsters hiding in plain sight. For Officer James "Jim" Walker, his career as a police officer in the small Texas town of Whitewood had been filled with its fair share of highs and lows. The community was tight-knit, the kind of place where everyone knew each other. Calls were usually minor, domestic disputes, speeding tickets, or the occasional theft. But some calls stayed with you forever. This was one of those calls. It was a sweltering afternoon in early August 2024, and Jim was sitting in his patrol car near the town square, sipping iced coffee and trying to beat the heat. The radio crackled to life, breaking the monotony of his shift. All units, we've got a missing child. Last seen at 1620 Birchwood Lane. 3-year-old boy. Name's Max Carter. Jim's heart sank. Missing child calls were the ones every officer dreaded. The kind of cases that could go from bad to worse in an instant. He tossed his coffee aside, flipped on his lights, and sped toward the address. The Carter family's house was in a quiet suburban neighborhood lined with oak trees and well-kept lawns. When Jim arrived, the scene was already in chaos. Neighbors had gathered in the yard, murmuring to each other as Max's mother, Kelly Carter, paced frantically, tears streaming down her face. Jim approached her, keeping his tone calm and steady. "Ma'am, I'm Officer Walker. Can you tell me what happened?" Kelly struggled to speak through her sobs. He was playing in the backyard. I only went inside for a few minutes to get him a snack. When I came back, he was gone. I've searched everywhere." Jim nodded, his training kicking in. "We're going to find him, ma'am. Can you tell me what he was wearing?" "A red t-shirt and blue shorts," she choked out. "Any chance he could have wandered into the house or a neighbor's yard?" Kelly shook her head. "I checked everywhere. He's not there." Jim radioed for additional units and began searching the property. The backyard was large, with a tall wooden fence enclosing it. There was a small swing set in one corner and a garden in another. Nothing seemed out of place, except for the pool. The family had an in-ground pool covered by a translucent tarp, secured tightly at the edges. Jim felt his stomach tighten as he approached it. He'd been on too many calls where water played a tragic role. "Kelly," he called out gently, "did you check the pool?" Her face went pale, and she shook her head. "I didn't think the tarp's on." He couldn't have. Jim didn't finish her sentence. He knelt by the pool and carefully lifted the edge of the tarp. The water was murky, a mix of dirt and leaves clouding its surface. "Max?" Jim called, his voice steady but loud enough to echo across the yard. At first, there was nothing, but then Jim's heart dropped. Beneath the water, barely visible through the murk, he spotted something red. "Stay back," he told Kelly firmly as she rushed toward him. He reached into the water, his hands trembling as he pulled up the small, lifeless body of Max Carter. The boy's red t-shirt clung to him, his blue shorts stained with dirt from the pool. Kelly's scream pierced the air, a sound so raw and painful it made Jim's chest ache. Jim immediately began CPR, his hands moving with precision despite the adrenaline surging through his veins. He counted each compression, desperate to bring the boy back. "Come on, Max," he muttered under his breath. "Come on." But Max didn't respond. The paramedics arrived minutes later, taking over as Jim stepped back, his hands shaking. He watched helplessly as they worked on the boy, but deep down, he knew. Max was pronounced dead at the scene. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Jim stayed to comfort Kelly and her husband, Daniel, who had arrived home from work moments after the paramedics. The look of devastation on their faces was something Jim would never forget. For weeks after the incident, Jim couldn't shake the image of Max in the water. It haunted his dreams, and even in his waking hours, he found himself replaying the scene over and over. He went over every detail, wondering if there was something he could have done differently. He learned later that Max had been trying to retrieve a toy that had fallen into the pool. He must have loosened the tarp enough to slip under, but once he was in the water, the weight of the tarp trapped him beneath the surface. The tragedy shook the entire town. The Carters became reclusive, their once lively home now eerily quiet. Neighbors placed flowers and stuffed animals by their mailbox, a somber memorial for a life lost too soon. Jim tried to move on, but the guilt lingered. He'd seen his fair share of heartache on the job, but this felt different. This felt personal. One evening, about a month after Max's death, Jim sat in his patrol car outside the Carters' house. He wasn't sure why he'd driven there. Maybe to pay his respects, or maybe because he couldn't let go. As he sat there, he noticed something strange. The backyard lights flickered on and off, even though the house was dark. Jim's curiosity got the better of him, and he stepped out of his car, walking quietly toward the backyard. The pool was still covered, but something caught his eye. A small, red ball floated on top of the tarp, the same ball Max had been playing with the day he disappeared. Jim's breath caught in his throat. He looked around, but the yard was empty. The wind rustled the trees, and for a moment, he thought he heard laughter. Faint, childlike, and echoing softly in the night. He left quickly, his heart pounding. He didn't mention the incident to anyone, not even his fellow officers. But sometimes, late at night, he'd find himself driving past the Carters' house, half expecting to see the backyard lights flickering again. Jim eventually left the force the following year, unable to shake the memories of that fateful day. Max's laughter, the weight of his small body in his arms, and Kelly's heartbreaking screams had become too much to bear. And though he'd never admit it out loud, part of him believed that Max's spirit still lingered, a reminder of the innocent life that had been taken too soon. Officer Sarah Grady had been working in the small Texas town of Elmwood for just over 3 years. It was the kind of town where not much happened. A few speeding tickets, the occasional drunken scuffle at the local bar, and the ever-present calls about strange lights or weird noises in the countryside. Most of the time, those calls amounted to nothing, dismissed as pranksters or people spooking themselves. But the call on a cold October night in 2024 was different. Sarah was on patrol, her cruiser parked at the edge of town where the old state highway met an overgrown cornfield. The highway had been all but abandoned years ago when a newer bypass was built, leaving the stretch of road desolate and forgotten. That's when her radio crackled. Unit 4, we've got a report of a possible break-in at the old gas station on Route 27. A passerby saw a light inside. Sarah frowned. She knew the gas station well. It had been shut down for over a decade, a decaying relic of the town's heyday. Kids occasionally broke in for a thrill, but no one had been bold enough to mess with it in years. "Copy that," Sarah responded. She flipped on her headlights and made her way down the dark, narrow road toward the gas station. When she arrived, the building looked as decrepit as ever. The paint was peeling, the windows were boarded up, and the roof sagged under years of neglect. But something was off. A faint light flickered inside, moving erratically like someone with a flashlight. Sarah parked her cruiser and approached the building, her hand resting on the holster of her gun. The cornfield behind the station rustled softly in the wind, adding to the eerie stillness of the night. "Elmwood PD," she called out, her voice firm. "If anyone's in there, come out now." The light inside stopped moving. Sarah's heart raced as she stepped closer. She tried the door, but it was locked. Peering through a crack in the boarded window, she caught a glimpse of the interior. A dusty counter, overturned shelves, and the faint glow of the flashlight bouncing off the walls. "I'm not going to ask again," she said louder this time. "Come out, hands up." Suddenly, the light darted toward the back of the building. Sarah heard the unmistakable sound of a door creaking open and heavy footsteps running into the field. She rushed around the side of the station, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. The back door was ajar, swinging slightly in the breeze. Beyond it, the tall stalks of corn swayed like shadowy figures. "Stop! Police!" Sarah shouted, but the footsteps didn't stop. She plunged into the cornfield, her boots crunching against the dry earth. The rows of corn were dense, the stalks taller than her, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. The beam of her flashlight illuminated the path, but whoever she was chasing stayed just out of sight. The footsteps grew fainter, and for a moment, Sarah thought she'd lost them. She paused, catching her breath, when she heard something to her left, a faint, raspy whisper. Her flashlight swung in that direction, but there was nothing there, just the endless rows of corn. "Come out now, and this doesn't have to get worse," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. The whispering grew louder, surrounding her. It wasn't just one voice, it was several, overlapping in a chaotic murmur. Sarah's grip on her flashlight tightened as she turned in a slow circle, the beam darting between the stalks. Then she saw it. A figure stood just ahead, partially hidden by the corn. It was tall and thin, its face obscured by shadows. It didn't move, didn't run, just stood there, watching. "Hands where I can see them," Sarah ordered, her voice firm. The figure didn't comply. Instead, it tilted its head slightly, as if studying her. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, and Sarah felt an overwhelming sense of dread. Her instincts screamed at her to leave, but she held her ground. "I said, hands where I can see them." The figure stepped closer, and that's when Sarah realized something was horribly wrong. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, like a puppet being yanked by invisible strings. Her flashlight caught its face, pale, hollow, and featureless, with empty black sockets where eyes should have been. Sarah stumbled back, her hand going to her gun. But before she could draw it, the figure disappeared, dissolving into the shadows of the cornfield. Heart pounding, Sarah made her way back to the gas station. The whispers followed her, faint and mocking, until she stepped out of the cornfield and onto the cracked pavement. She called for backup, her voice trembling as she described what had happened. By the time the other officers arrived, the gas station was dark again. They searched the building and the cornfield but found no sign of the intruder or the strange figure Sarah had seen. All they found was an old flashlight, its battery long dead, lying in the middle of the field. Over the next few weeks, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. At night, she'd wake to the sound of whispers outside her window, though no one was ever there. She learned later that the gas station had a dark history. Years ago, a transient man was found dead in the cornfield behind it, his body mutilated beyond recognition. Locals whispered that his restless spirit still haunted the area, but Sarah hadn't believed it until now. The incident changed her. She stayed on the force but refused to patrol near Route 27 after dark. And though she tried to forget what she saw, the memory of the featureless figure in the cornfield stayed with her. A haunting reminder of the night she came face to face with something beyond explanation. To this day, Sarah avoids the area, but sometimes, when the wind rustles the corn, she swears she can still hear the whispers calling her name.
Yes, ma'am, we'll be clear, and 233 will be clear on it.
The sleepy coastal town of Galewood, Texas, had always been quiet. A stretch of sandy beaches, fishing docks, and pastel-colored homes. It was the kind of place where news traveled fast and life moved slow. Officer Dean Mercer liked it that way. He transferred from Houston 2 years ago, leaving behind the chaos of the city for the tranquility of a small-town police force. But on a foggy October morning in 2024, Galewood's peaceful reputation was shattered. Dean was just finishing his coffee at the station when the call came in. "Unit 3, we've got a body washed up on Crescent Beach." Caller is a local fisherman. Dean set his mug down, grabbed his radio, and headed for his cruiser. Crescent Beach was a popular spot for early morning walkers and fishermen, but bodies weren't something anyone expected to find there. The drive to the beach was short, and when Dean arrived, he found the fisherman, a wiry man in his 60s named Carl, pacing near the shoreline. "I found it just down there," Carl said, pointing to a stretch of sand near the dunes. "Didn't touch it, didn't want to." Dean followed Carl's gaze and saw it, the body, lying face down in the sand, half covered by seaweed. The tide had washed over it, leaving a trail of wet sand leading back to the water. Dean approached cautiously, pulling on a pair of gloves. The body was male, mid-30s, dressed in a white button-down shirt and slacks. His shoes were missing, and his skin was pale and wrinkled from prolonged exposure to the water. "Any ID on him?" Carl asked from a distance. Dean shook his head. "Not yet." He crouched down and carefully rolled the body onto its back. The man's face was bloated, his features barely recognizable, but what caught Dean's attention was the object clutched in the man's hand. A small, weathered piece of paper. Dean pried the paper from the man's stiff fingers, careful not to tear it. It was damp and smudged, but the words scrawled on it were still legible. Mile marker 12. Don't follow. A chill ran down Dean's spine as he read the note. The coroner arrived shortly after, loading the body into the van for transport to the morgue. Dean stayed behind, staring out at the ocean. The fog hung low over the water, obscuring the horizon. Back at the station, Dean began digging into missing persons reports. None of them matched the man on the beach. Without an ID or any leads, the case stalled, until the coroner called later that afternoon. "You need to see this," Dr. Nolan said, his voice tight. Dean drove to the morgue, where Dr. Nolan led him to the examination room. The body lay on the table, covered by a sheet. "Take a look at this," Nolan said, pulling back the sheet to reveal the man's torso. Dean leaned in, his brow furrowing. The man's chest was marked with faint scratches, forming what looked like letters or symbols. "It's not random," Nolan said. "Someone carved this into him." The symbols were jagged, almost frantic, and they formed a phrase that made Dean's blood run cold. "It watches." Over the next few days, Dean couldn't shake the feeling that something about the case was off. He returned to Crescent Beach, searching for clues, but found nothing. Then, 2 nights later, another call came in. "Unit 3, we've got a report of strange activity near mile marker 12, on the coast road." Caller says they saw lights. Dean's heart skipped a beat. Mile marker 12, the same location mentioned in the note. He grabbed his keys and headed out, the radio crackling with updates as he drove. The road to mile marker 12 was narrow and winding, flanked by cliffs on one side and dense forest on the other. When Dean arrived, he parked his cruiser and stepped out, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. At first, he saw nothing, but as he approached the marker, he noticed faint footprints in the sand leading toward the edge of the cliffs. He followed the trail cautiously, the wind whipping around him. The footprints stopped abruptly at the edge, as if whoever made them had disappeared into thin air. Then he saw it, a faint, flickering light out on the water. It moved erratically, like a lantern being swung back and forth. Dean radioed for backup, but the signal was weak, distorted by static. He moved closer to the edge, squinting to make out the source of the light. That's when he heard the whispering. It was faint at first, carried on the wind, but it grew louder with each passing second. The voices overlapped, speaking in a language Dean didn't recognize. The light vanished, and the whispering stopped. Dean stood there, frozen, his mind racing. He turned back toward his cruiser, but something caught his eye. A figure standing at the edge of the forest, partially obscured by the shadows. "Who's there?" Dean called out, his hand instinctively going to his holstered gun. The figure didn't move. Dean took a step forward, his flashlight illuminating the area. The figure was gone. When backup arrived, they found no trace of the figure or the light. Dean didn't mention the whispering. He wasn't sure anyone would believe him. The body from the beach remained unidentified, and the symbols carved into his chest were never explained. But over the following weeks, more reports came in. Strange lights near the cliffs, whispers in the wind, and shadowy figures lurking in the forest. Dean began to avoid the area, but the case haunted him. Late at night, he'd replay the events in his mind, wondering what really happened on Crescent Beach. Months later, Dean received an anonymous letter in the mail. It contained only 3 words, written in shaky handwriting: "Don't look back." Dean moved away from Galewood shortly after, but sometimes, when he closes his eyes, he hears the whispers again, growing louder, calling him back to the cliffs.
Yes, ma'am, we'll be clear, and 233 will be clear on it.
In the small Texas town of Willow Creek, Officer Ben Harlow had grown accustomed to quiet shifts and the occasional late-night call about a wandering coyote or a neighbor's dispute. It wasn't the kind of place where strange things happened, and that's how Ben liked it. But everything changed on a cold November night in 2024. Ben was sitting in his patrol car, sipping a cup of coffee and listening to the low hum of the police scanner when a call came in that made him sit up straight. "Unit 6, we've got a report of an abandoned vehicle on County Road 16, near the woods." Caller says it's been there since yesterday and looks suspicious. Ben sighed, grabbing his radio. Unit 6 responding. Abandoned vehicles weren't unusual, especially on the old back roads. Most of the time, it was a case of someone running out of gas or leaving their car after a breakdown. But something about this call felt different. County Road 16 was a narrow, winding road that cut through a dense forest. It was poorly lit, with tall trees casting shadows that stretched across the cracked pavement. Ben's headlights illuminated the way as he drove, the beams cutting through the thick fog that had rolled in earlier that evening. It didn't take long to spot the car. A black sedan sat on the side of the road, its front end partially hidden by overgrown bushes. The driver's side door was ajar, swinging slightly in the wind. Ben parked behind the car and stepped out, his breath visible in the chilly air. "Willow Creek PD," he called out, his voice echoing into the trees. "Anyone here?" Silence. Ben approached the vehicle cautiously, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The car looked to be in decent condition, no flat tires, no broken windows. But as he got closer, he noticed something odd. The interior of the car was covered in dirt and debris, as if someone had been living in it. Empty food wrappers, water bottles, and a tattered blanket were strewn across the seats. Then he saw the blood. It wasn't a lot, just a few small smears on the steering wheel and a tissue soaked in crimson lying on the passenger seat. But it was enough to make Ben's stomach tighten. He radioed dispatch. "This is Unit 6. I've got an abandoned vehicle on County Road 16. There's blood inside. Requesting backup." As he waited for a response, he circled the car, scanning the ground with his flashlight. That's when he noticed the footprints. They led away from the car and into the woods, the faint outlines visible in the damp soil. Ben hesitated. Every instinct told him to wait for backup, but something about the scene compelled him to follow the trail. Gripping his flashlight tightly, he stepped into the woods. The trees seemed to close in around him, their bare branches clawing at the sky. The air was cold and still, the only sound the crunch of leaves under his boots. The footprints continued deeper into the forest, winding between trees and over patches of moss. After about 10 minutes, Ben came to a clearing. In the center stood an old, rusted mailbox on a wooden post, leaning at an awkward angle. He approached it cautiously, shining his flashlight on the faded numbers barely visible on the side. 327. The mailbox looked out of place, as if it had been abandoned long ago. But when Ben opened it, he found something that made his blood run cold. Inside was a severed hand, pale and lifeless, resting on a crumpled piece of paper. Ben's heart raced as he stepped back, his hand instinctively going to his holstered gun. He scanned the clearing, his flashlight darting between the trees, but he was alone. He radioed dispatch again, his voice trembling. "Unit 6. I need immediate backup at my location. Found. Human remains in the woods. Over." The paper in the mailbox caught his eye. Despite every fiber of his being telling him to wait, he reached for it. The note was hastily written, the ink smudged. "It's watching. Don't go further." Ben's pulse quickened. The trail didn't end at the clearing. It continued deeper into the woods. Against his better judgment, he followed it. The deeper he went, the stranger the forest became. The trees grew closer together, their twisted branches forming a canopy that blocked out the moonlight. The air felt heavier, almost suffocating, and an eerie silence enveloped him. Then he heard it, a faint rustling ahead. Ben froze, his flashlight aimed at the source of the noise. "Willow Creek PD. Come out with your hands up." The rustling stopped. He took a cautious step forward, his flashlight illuminating a pile of leaves and branches. At first, it looked like nothing more than debris, but as he got closer, he realized it was a makeshift shelter. Inside was a tattered sleeping bag, a pile of canned food, and a notebook. Ben picked up the notebook, its pages filled with frantic scribbles and crude drawings. Words like "they're watching" and "don't trust the trees" were repeated over and over. One drawing caught his attention, a crude sketch of a figure, tall and thin, with hollow eyes and elongated limbs. Beneath it were the words, "It lives here." Suddenly, the rustling resumed, louder this time. Ben spun around, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. A figure stood just beyond the edge of the beam, its features obscured by shadows. It was tall, unnaturally so, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. Ben drew his gun. "Don't move." The figure didn't respond. Instead, it tilted its head, as if studying him. Then it moved. With unnatural speed, it darted between the trees, its limbs bending in ways that didn't seem possible. Ben fired a shot, but the figure was gone. Panic set in as he stumbled back toward the trail, his flashlight flickering. The forest seemed to close in around him, the shadows growing darker and more oppressive. He ran, his breath coming in short gasps, until he finally broke through the tree line and collapsed onto the road. Backup arrived minutes later, finding Ben sitting by his cruiser, his face pale and his hands shaking. A search of the woods turned up nothing. No figure, no shelter, no severed hand. The car was towed, and the blood inside was sent for analysis, but no matches were ever found. The case remained open, but Ben knew he'd never get answers. To this day, he refuses to talk about what he saw in the woods that night. But sometimes, when he drives down County Road 16, he feels the same oppressive presence, watching from the shadows. And in his nightmares, he sees the figure again. Its hollow eyes staring back at him, and the chilling words echoing in his mind. "It lives here."